I'd like to turn it over to Lara, who will talk about the work of her team and partners in King County.
Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about King County's new sea level rise risk area as part of SIG's 25th anniversary event. We could go to the next slide. Thank you. King County sea level rise concerns include risks to the built environment and to our natural systems. Like many communities, we have low-lying public and private infrastructure that provides essential services. We have residential shoreline development, including development along erosion-prone coastal bluffs. That is, by the way, down here in this corner, a house at the bottom of that bluff. We have extensive nearshore habitat that's critical to the recovery of Puget Sound salmon and orca. And we have much beloved public recreation sites that are important parts of our communities. I'm seeing a message that they're not seeing the slides. Is that happening for others as well? Okay, great, thank you. I will continue. Next slide, please. In 2018, King County convened an interdepartmental team to review King County land use codes and policies and to develop recommendations for updating those codes as needed to account for sea level rise. A total of 35 possible changes were identified by the project team, and 17 were advanced as recommendations for implementation. My presentation today is focused on one set of changes adopted by the King County Council in July to address changes in coastal flood risk. I also want to note that this work was part of our 2015 Strategic Climate Action Plan, which is our 5-year strategy for guiding work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and prepare for the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. One of the major questions we wrestled with as a team was how to get ahead of the risk that is coming. When we look at coastal flooding, the regulations to address that flooding are tied to FEMA designated 100-year flood zones, which are the areas identified as having a 1% annual chance of flooding. The problem, however, is that FEMA floodplain updates are infrequent. Mapping can take 20 years or more. And these updates do not, at least at this point, include sea level rise. What this meant is that relying on FEMA floodplain updates to address changing coastal flood risks would in effect put us in the position of chasing sea level rise risk over time rather than actually getting ahead of it. So what did we do? Next slide, please. The first thing that we had to do was to decide how much sea level rise we were planning for. This is where we really benefited from the work of the Climate Impacts Group and Washington Sea Grant and other partners with the development of updated sea level rise scenarios through the Washington Coastal Resilience Project. The updated methodology used to develop those scenarios allowed us to explore our risk tolerance for sea level rise within King County and to ultimately determine on a range of values that fit what we felt was the appropriate range to manage for. That range was 2 to 5 feet of sea level rise. Next slide. We then turned our attention to our current floodplain regulations. Oh, I'm sorry, could you back up a slide? Thank you. King County has one of the strongest, if not the strongest, floodplain development requirements in the state. Most notably, if you build a new house or do a major remodel within the 100-year flood zone, the bottom of the first finished floor has to be at least 3 feet above the height of the 100-year flood. That is that red dotted line that you see on the figure. This means that if the water level in the 100-year flood is at 16 feet elevation, that bottom of the first finished floor has to be at least 19 feet in elevation. It's worth noting that most jurisdictions require 1 foot above base flood elevation. Some require none, some require 2. We are the only jurisdiction in the state of Washington to require 3 feet above base flood elevation. This was a change that was made more than a decade ago, partly in response to concerns about sea level rise and also recognizing some of the uncertainties around FEMA floodplain mapping. The key thing to note, though, is once you got out of that 100-year floodplain zone, you could build at whatever elevation you wanted. You could build at ground level. And the challenge, of course, is that as sea level rises, there's nothing magical about the boundary of that zone. The water will cross that line. There's no invisible force field. So this, again, was this question of what do we do about development beyond the existing floodplain boundary, knowing that the water is coming? Next slide, please. In July of 2020, as part of our comprehensive plan, King County adopted a new sea level rise risk area. This extended our coastal floodplain development requirements into what is now known as the risk area. So now, new construction and major remodels built within that zone have to be constructed to 3 feet above the adjoining base flood elevation. This, for the first time, gives us the opportunity to get ahead of this risk. We no longer have to wait for the FEMA floodplain zones to be extended to start providing the necessary public safety protections for addressing sea level rise. In addition to the building height requirement, we also restricted the development of new groundwater wells in the coastal high hazard area, set surface seal requirements for wells within the sea level rise risk area to prevent saltwater intrusion, and increase setback requirements for development at the tops of bluffs that extend into the sea level rise risk area. Next slide. In many ways, this approach for the sea level rise risk area ended up being quite a simple solution to a very complex question and set of issues. And because it is tied to the FEMA flood zones and the boundaries that are delineated through that process, but going beyond that, it is a somewhat self-tending solution, which is helpful. As those floodplains do get updated, our sea level rise risk area will move back as well, always creating that opportunity to stay ahead of the defined problem. But one question, of course, is that enough? We have given ourselves some time to start addressing this problem, but there are more difficult decisions to be made. So there is considerable more work to be done. The nice thing about this approach, though, is that we do believe that it's a good model for other jurisdictions to consider, and to date have had several requests for the code so other jurisdictions can start looking at this. More importantly, I want to note that this is really the opening chapters of a story about how we address sea level rise on the King County shoreline, in this case, Vashon and Maury Island. There's more to be written, and I look forward to coming back and hopefully for SIG's next anniversary to tell you how that story unfolds. Thank you.